and welcome to our video lesson on writing the comparative essay. This segment will be suitable for Year 12 Advanced English. So we're going to talk a little bit about preparing the core essay. A core essay is like a blueprint of your very best argument. So it's a great place to start, but keep in mind it is only like training wheels. You are going to have to take them off eventually and learn to write essays from scratch that directly respond to the question. You're not going to be able to get through the HSC by simply memorizing one essay. What's actually a lot better is to edit your essays over time and keep track of the variations used to answer different types of questions on your computer. So then you can have, say, 8 or 9 really good essays saved, and having responded to those ones, you'll find if you come across a similar question in the exam, you've already got a fairly good idea of how to answer it. So that's actually the better way to prepare. Another thing you're going to need to do to prepare is to create a table so that it's a lot easier to write the rest of your essay. So if you were doing elective 1, you'd have to consider identifying the connection, decide whether or not it's an implicit or explicit connection, what type of connection is it, so it's to do with structure, language, a theme, link it to the contextual value in text 1 and provide a technique and quote, and then do the same thing for text 2. So here's an example of what you might lay out. So the depiction of Mrs. Bennet, it takes place in Pride and Prejudice and also in Letters to Alice. So this would be an explicit connection because it's a direct reference, so the name Mrs. Bennet appears in both texts. The kind of connection would be a characterization, although the characterization is going to be slightly different because of values. So now I'm going to say what is it in the text and then what does that reflect in terms of values. So Mrs. Bennet is vulgar and silly. That's how she is in the text. So that reflects the gentry's view of the merchant class, or nouveau riche, which is obviously not a very favourable one. So she's a very silly woman who runs around saying, "my poor nerves," all the time. So that's one view, and that's how she is presented in Pride and Prejudice. But if we look at Letters to Alice, Mrs. Bennet is a completely different kind of character. She's understandably frantic that her daughters are going to die in poverty if they can't get married. So this view is reflecting second wave feminism in the 1980s, where people were very concerned about the social and economic pressures on women. So a quote from Faye Weldon to show us this is where she says, in that time period, women only inherited through their husbands. So you can see that we've laid out all the information that we're probably going to need to put in an essay, and if you have all of your parallels or connections laid out like that, it's going to be a lot easier. So let's look at an example for the second elective, text and time. So here it's a bit simpler. We just have the parallel, what type of parallel it is, link it to a contextual value in the first text, the older one, and then link it to a contextual value in the younger text. And of course we're going to provide a technique and quote to go with that as well. So if we're going to look at the parallel of depicting women's deaths in Frankenstein and Blade Runner, we might call that parallel a motif because several women die in both texts. And the example in the first text is Elizabeth and Justine, who both die as innocents. Their voices are silenced as they are hanged or strangled. This reflects the 1800s notion of women as being weak or passive, and there's a really good quote from Justine that shows this, where she says, "Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me, he threatened and menaced." So we've said how it's appeared in the text, and also linked it to the value that shows this at the time period. Now we're going to do the same thing for the younger text. Pris and Zora are not innocents, but are quite sexual and dangerous. Their deaths are violent, one shatters through a plate of glass, and the other ends up writhing on the ground, reflecting women as assertive individuals. So it might seem a bit strange to say that killing women shows that they're assertive, but what they're saying is that because they don't die without a struggle, because they put up a fight, that makes them more individualistic. So before you come to write your essay, you're going to want to make sure you have one of those tables with all of the parallels or connections in them. And then you're going to sit down and think very carefully because we're going to write a completely new type of essay. It's probably good to have the structure in front of you as you go through. So the introduction isn't too different. The first thing you do is address the question using keywords from the question and make sure that you've used some words from your thesis to answer it as well. We're going to go into detail about what kind of thesis you should write in the editing the essay video. Then you're going to name text 1, which will be the older text, with the year it was published in brackets after it. You always want to put the older text first because aside from making sense in chronological order, there's a chance that the older text influenced the younger text as well. You're going to indicate the genre, text type, and composer of the text, and then give a brief summary of text one's cultural context. So probably no more than a sentence. So really this is just an opportunity to throw in a few key words to orient the reader, because you are going to spend a lot of time talking about cultural context later. So if I was doing John Donne's poetry, I might say Jacobean era, England, a late Renaissance, and I might say metaphysical poetry and ex-Catholic. And that would be all I'd say. We're going to do the same thing for the younger text, text 2, with the year it was published in brackets after it. Indicate the genre, text type, and composer. And then give a brief summary of text 2's cultural context. Now this is the bit that a lot of people leave out. They seem to think that there's no culture associated with the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but let me assure you it's very different from the time period we live in today, and you do need to identify it. And then we have another divergence. You have to then identify why the two texts are to be studied together. So you almost have to justify why were they picked for comparative study. So mention the idea that links them, or the genre that they come from if that's the reason they've been paired together. So if you were looking at Frankenstein and Blade Runner, you might say that both of them have artificial human beings and that's why they're connected. If we're looking at Pride and Prejudice and Letters to Alice, it might be that the reason they're connected is that they explore women's issues. So you should probably make it clear in that first introduction why the two texts have been put together. The final thing you need to do is identify the main ideas you're going to discuss and introduce them in the order they're going to appear. So we call this signposting, and in a comparative essay, you're probably only going to have 3 or 4 paragraphs because the paragraphs are going to be a lot longer. So it's a good idea to list them in order here, and yeah, there should be 3 or 4 ideas you're going to discuss. In one body paragraph, this one's going to be a little bit different from what you're used to. The topic sentence, you must introduce the parallel or the connection that's in both texts. Try and be concrete and specific about this, don't generalize. You also want to make sure you use the word either parallel or connection, and if you're doing exploring connections, you want to use the word implicit or explicit to tell us which kind of connection you're exploring. Then you're going to explain how text 1 treats the idea and link it to its contextual values, so pretty much like we did in the table. Then you name a technique and quote from text 1 to support it. So notice the order here. We talk about the context first and the value, and then we find an example in the text. We're not going to talk about the text and then try and use the context to justify it. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing for text 2. How does it treat the theme? Link it to its contextual value. Name a technique and a quote to support it. And then we're going to comment on whether or not it's a similarity or a difference between the texts. So in exploring connections, you'll be talking about the similarity. In text and time, you're going to be talking about the difference and how it shows a change in values over time. Then you're going to say what message each text has about this issue or value, and you're going to do shaping and reshaping. So you're now going to use another technique and quote from either the first text or the second text to explain how the first text changed your opinion of the second, or vice versa. Then in your conclusion sentence, you're going to link whatever value or message you were talking about back to the original question and use a couple of keywords from your thesis again. So it's a long process. You want to make sure that you do it very carefully. Each dot point should maybe be 1 sentence. And try not to waffle or get too distracted by all of the things you could possibly say about the context. So the conclusion's pretty much like what you're used to. You're going to use words such as finally or ultimately to create a tone of finality, but don't use in conclusion because it's lame. Refer back to the question using a few keywords and making sure you've really answered it. You're also going to explain the ultimate message of each text. So in this case, it might be for Frankenstein and Blade Runner, it might be that it's really important to consider what makes humans human. In something like Donne and Wit, it might be that it's important to consider suffering and the meaning that may come out of it. You also should explain the text's continued effect and influence on today's audience or literature. So one good example of this would be Frankenstein. So it's an 1800s text, so very old and stuffy, but there's a million B-grade movies based on Frankenstein. When there's Halloween, you can see Frankenstein masks out there. So it really kind of has permeated today's culture as well. So you don't have to give every single example, but it might be nice to sort of give a heads up to this idea. You also want to identify the continuing importance of the parallel connections. Why should we be thinking about those ideas? And then finally, we want to explain why the text should be studied together. And this is where you use a nice buzzword called their synergistic value. So what you're saying here is that if you study text A, you're going to learn this amount. If you study text B, you'll learn that amount. But if you study text A and B together, you're going to learn much, much more than simply the product of studying them both independently. So synergistic value is the justification in a way for doing a comparative study. So it's a good idea to think about why you said the two texts were put together in the introduction. And of course, with every conclusion, you're going to give a mature comment on the value of the text or message for society and leave your marker with something deep to think about. So some philosophical social issue, which we like to call a beard stroking moment. So that should be where they go, what a deep student. That's the final thing you want to leave them to think about and make a really good impression with your phrasing. So now we come to the question that almost every student is going to ask. Why do I have to integrate? So I'm actually not a big fan of integration in other kinds of essays. I wouldn't ask you to integrate in the area of study, but when you're doing a comparative study, it's pretty much impossible to do any deep comparison if you're going to keep the two texts in a block-by-block essay in separate paragraphs. You're also going to find that if you don't integrate, you're going to forget to do shaping and reshaping, because you need to kind of do that at the end once you've talked about both texts, and do you put it with the first text or the second text? It gets a bit awkward and you'll find that you end up leaving it out. Integrating can be an issue because it can lead people to waffle a bit and get off the track. So try and make sure that you're sticking very closely to the paragraph structure, and especially for the first few essays you write, you should have it open in front of you as you're working. So now we're going to talk about how you should be thinking about using the historical context you learn. So this is a system that I like to think of as what, why, fact, and how. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, what is the value? So let's go back to the old example with Pride and Prejudice. The gentry disliked the merchant classes and the nouveau riche. That is the value. Why does the value exist? What factors have contributed to making people feel this way? The merchants were getting richer than the gentry at that time and aspiring to titles or noble names. So that means that they were threatening the static social order that had existed in England for a long time. So now to say that, we want to cite a fact to back it up, something real and true from that time period that makes what we said sound more authentic. So it was thought that a person staying decorously in their place provided England with stability, something that was much needed when King George III was mad and the Prince Regent was a spendthrift. So normally in this time period, people relied on their monarchs to give them, show them the way of how to behave in society. But since these monarchs weren't really doing their jobs, the nobility felt that it was even more important to keep everybody else in their place. Not to mention that obviously the gentry benefit from that system as well. So when we come to how, we're thinking about how is this value shown in the text. So merchant class characters are portrayed as ignorant, embarrassing, and obsessed with money. Generally in Jane Austen's text, this is particularly true. So let's go back with Mrs. Bennet. In this setting, she is pretty much a merchant class character, even though she has married someone from the lower gentry. So an example from the text to prove it, she, Mrs. Bennet, was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. So you need to be able to back up what you're saying and show that it's true, but you also need to be able to explain the details of how an idea came about or how a value came to be. Whenever you're dealing with a contextual value, you should always try and put it through this process. That's the end of this lesson. If you feel like you need more help, please visit us at www.primeeducation.com.au.